Alright, so today we're going to be taking a look at something that was requested a good amount of time ago. This is the Horus Heresy Siege of Terra with Dan Abnett. Now, this was made in 2019. This was requested by Legion Reaper. And one of the things he wanted to see was a little bit of my perspective onto the stuff that he's going to talk about, some of which has already been released in Mortis. And there's a new book out that I have yet to get. I'm going to be in a location this week where it's just going to be a lot of me catching up on paperwork and stuff like that. So I'm going to be able to probably hook up to an audiobook. I'm going to download the new book, finish Mortis. I've got an hour left. Hour left in Mortis. And then once that's done, I'm going to be hopping right into the next book in the series. All that out of the way, I had a lot of fun with this one. The last time I had a video that was put out like this, it was done by Ars Techie, I believe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and check this one out. I'll pause every once in a while, give a little bit of my insight, my personal perspective, and we'll go with that. Alright, so the Hospitaller is watching something in the background. I just paused to check that. Here we go.
My name is Dan Abnett. I have been writing for the Black Library for more years than I'd care to admit. I'm the author of the Gaunt's Ghost series and the Eisenhorn Inquisitor cycle, and have been lucky enough to write several books in the Horus Heresy series, including the very first one, Horus Rising.
Yes.
Also Legion, Prospero Burns, Unremembered Empire.
So literally, I've only had one book of Dan Abnett's that I've actually had a problem with, and that was Prospero Burns. And it's because of the true name clause. And I don't think he would have done that willy-nilly. I'm not sure why he put that in there, but he put it in there regardless. But the rest of the books he talked about are some of the best in the series.
I've contributed it to it as often as I could. Being a writer is a very solitary occupation. You spend a lot of time alone in the room writing your own series of books with very little contact with anybody else. So actually writing the whole of the Horus Heresy series has been a pleasure over the years, because it's brought us out literally into a room where various writers brainstorm and discuss ideas and plan things out together, which is great, this idea of a writer's room. That has been the case all the way through the Heresy, because that's the only way we could manage such an enormous project. But for the Siege of Terra, which is this final section of books, we've really sort of focused on that, and all of the writers of that chunk of books has been gathered together for the meetings, discussing each one of them, even if it's not their book that we're writing. So the writers' room has been much more intense in the last couple of years, and we've really enjoyed that process. Sometimes it's one of us has imagined something that none of us others had come up with, but sometimes it's just simply being there in a room together that people have hear a discussion, and it spontaneously prompts an idea they wouldn't otherwise have had. Just the sort of creative atmosphere of the room. So it's great. It inevitably descends into ridiculousness and joking, but I think that's part of the necessary process of getting to the good stuff. It is not driven by committee. It's driven by a sort of collaborative process, which I think is very rewarding to be part of.
I like that. I think the whole thing about it, the books have gotten continuously better and better as they have gone on. There's been certain things that have been in the lore for years that now have backstory, and one of the things about the 41st millennium is like everything that you know has been forgotten and retold. So, like the Horus Heresy period, remember the Horus Heresy period was over 10,000 years ago at this point. So the events of the Horus Heresy happened before, if we are closer to the pyramids being built than the 41st, 42nd millennium is to, any of that happened in the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. So that length of time is just ridiculous. I mean, we know extremely basic things, but at the same time take the same kind of back and forth that we do these days and add in a massive amount of religious intent, and then you have intensely varied myths based off different subject matter.
Yeah, the heresy has always been more about the journey than the destination, to a certain extent. I think when we started way back in the mist of time, there was a very distinct linear progression through the first few books, just to get the whole thing moving, because it was such a big new milieu to open up for the purposes of publishing. And we all imagined at the time, in fact the original creative plan was that it would then be a setting in which we would tell stories that would cumulatively tell this huge legendary thing, but not necessarily book by book in a kind of progressive way, that we could diverge and do sort of smaller stories and all sorts of different things, so that it would ultimately build up over however many years it took to be a huge mosaic of things. And we found after a certain point that although people loved the books, they wanted that urgency, they wanted that sort of momentum, that the story was constantly driving forward and keeping to the main thing. So we reduced the amount of sort of side story we did,
okay,
and tried to fix it very much on that final destination.
One of the worst books in the entire Horus Heresy, in my opinion, is The Furious Abyss. And it's not because it's not real well written or anything like that. It's because it's a side story that doesn't go anywhere, and then the whole plot of the story is rendered completely and totally null and void in the very next book. That's the reason I didn't like that book. Anyway, books like that, I didn't enjoy that much because there was nothing more to take from them. There was nothing more to learn from them. There was no lore to carry forward. There was no, okay, this is why this is like this. There was no nothing. Dan Abnett wrote Legion. Now, Legion did essentially nothing except show why the Alpha Legion turned at the end of the day. And it took a whole book to lead up to that. Introduce characters like John Grammaticus, things like that. All these characters were introduced and stuff like that. But Legion was extremely good, despite it only having one major plot point and a few characters being added. Everything in Legion, like the ending of Legion, changed the way people viewed the Alpha Legion, and that's the kind of books that I enjoyed. And the trouble with the Horus Heresy, I suppose, like so many things, I compare it to Titanic, I suppose. We know what happens at the end. Yeah.
So it is how you get there is the interesting thing. But once we've arrived at the end, that's got to be very, very, very focused. It's got to be very, very complete. It's got to tie up so many different things. Part of our long discussions is trying to work out all the things that we must make sure that we reference or tie in or collect together or explain or whatever.
Right.
But it's also got to be dynamic and powerful in its own right, and without breaking the rules, because most people many people who are reading it already know the story, so they know how it's going to end up. That's hence the Titanic factor. You've got to deliver that. You've got to deliver that in a way that is appropriate and hopefully satisfying. But also, wherever possible, to show there was, as it were, more going on, to reveal things that come as a surprise or are unexpected, or are elements of this story that as it were, didn't survive into the historical record. So we're not going to break the continuity. We're not going to ruin things.
Yeah.
But we've carefully thought about over the years, and particularly recently, places in the story where there's new things that can be put in. There's elements of the story that is unrecorded. There are gaps that need to be explained, and that's part of the exciting thing. I think for the reader's point of view, they will get the story I hope they're expecting, and that will be delivered in a suitable, appropriate fashion. But also there will be a whole lot of story in there that they necessarily couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have expected. That will be deeply satisfying and add to the whole experience.
One of the side stories, like he was talking about, they're adding in stuff. One of my favorite ones was there's a legend of a guardsman that stood between Horus and the Emperor, and faced down Horus. Well, this legend might or might not be completely and totally bullshit, because what wound up happening was, I can't remember which Siege of Terra books it was. This one guy was talking about how infantrymen and soldiers need to exaggerate the details to give themselves something to aspire to. basically bullshitting for the sake of morale. And eventually, oh man, he had legitimately the most bad. I want to do a 5-minute lore on that guy. That's what I need to do. I need to do a 5-minute lore on that beast of a human. Any case, moving on.
When we first assembled the Siege of Terra authors for the first of these writers' room things to sort of officially inaugurate the fact that we were now entering the final phase and these books were actually happening, there was. I didn't personally have it, but I expected there'd be a sort of slightly bittersweet melancholy air to things because we were reaching the end of a road that had been enormously enjoyable to walk. But I couldn't. Just the atmosphere of sheer excitement in the room, and that has maintained, has been extraordinary. And I don't think we're I don't think it's like kind of end of term fever. We're nearly there, then the holidays begin. I think it's. I remember how exciting it was for the very first meetings when we were actually planning, before there were any Horus Heresy novels, and when the whole thing was being proposed, and we were meeting to plan these things. There was a sense of huge honour that we were getting to do this, a huge excitement because we never dreamt that this would be something that could happen. But right from those early meetings, there was always in the back of our minds a certain a necessary confidence that we had to have that we would one day tell the whole story and reach the end, because there was no point embarking upon it if we weren't going to actually get there. So we all sort of, I guess, imagined writing the end, because that would be something that we got to. We didn't know how long it would take. We presumed we would all still be doing it. We presumed, of course, that the series would be successful enough to justify that it would go on and reach that point. And now we reach the end. There's almost a remarkable sense of shock and surprise that we can't actually believe that we've almost got there, and it's almost happening, and we're actually getting to write the thing.
I can't believe I'm there, and I've been just reading the books and listening to the books on audio. I can't believe I've gotten through as many books as I've gotten through. My library and Audible just looks like an absolute tragedy.
Things that we dreamed about. It's almost like having a book in your head for years and years and years that you've always wanted the opportunity to write, a sort of personal project, but you'll do it one day, and it's just that sort of idle ambition. And sort of the end of the heresy is that very much because we expected to do it, we were confident we would get there, but actually it's now happening. It's almost more shocking than it was at the beginning when we got asked to do the heresy in the first place. It comes as a greater surprise. So I'm sure there will be tears before bedtime because we're saying goodbye to this. But it has generated an energy that is remarkable, almost more than it was at the very, very start. This sort of real sense that we've come this far, we have to do the job properly. We have to really make this the best possible thing. There's the expectation, performance pressure, whatever you call all the sort of, but also a desire in us to make sure that we're going to go out on the right note. This is an opportunity to do something sort of definitive and really, really important. So actually, the melancholy is like 7 or 8 points down on the list of things that we're feeling.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good God!
Right from before the whole series started, there was a vast amount of material that we had to digest that was already established, essentially established lore, although a lot of it was inevitably contradictory. But there's so much stuff had been written about it, and we put that all together and we assimilated it, and we used it as springboards, connected it together, filled in the gaps, did all the sorts of things like that. You feel, I think, if any 40k fan who's got a library full of codexes and White Dwarfs and stuff like that would feel that they knew a vast amount about the Siege of Terra, because they could go into their hobby room and probably pull off the shelves a stack this deep of stuff that covered that. And there is a lot of detail. But when we actually sat down and thought about what things do we actually need to know?
Right.
What things do we need to plan for? There are enormous amounts of stuff that is sort of vague. It's just suggested. That the implication is that we know it, but actually when it comes down to it, we don't know the nitty-gritty. And of course that's really vital to work out, because I suppose if it was just me or just John or just Guy or just Aaron writing the Siege of Terra, you could perform that kind of authorial misdirection in your own work because you kind of had a subconscious idea about what it was you were saying, and you can draw a veil of vagueness over the other stuff, and the book or books would therefore be delivered to the reader in a way that they will go, oh man, that's great, that told me everything I needed to know. But when there's a group of you working on it, we have to interrelate. We have to interrelate the things we're doing and where things are. So actually having a really concrete plan is vital. Otherwise, we're all going to get lost between each other's books and lose the thread and go, well, I've had this thing happen here because, of course, that's right next door to it. No, it's not right next door to it. It's over here.
Right.
So mapping Terra and mapping the palace, literally mapping the palace, was one of the first things to do. And in fact, in one of the first meetings, we started talking about it and we said, we've got to have a comprehensive map. Can we go?
See, that's something that I think, like, I would love to be a part of a project like that, because just the sheer, I can imagine what he's describing now. Imagine what they're talking about. I wish I could see a picture of the writer's room and just see that map of the siege of Terra, and see the map that they have for the surrounding systems of Terra. I'd love to see that. I would absolutely love to see that. And my pug has decided to pay me another visit. And now he's just staring at me. What do you want, pug? Do you want to be on the camera? You want to say hey? Come here. Come here. Don't sit down. Come here. I'm trying to pick you up. Trying to pick you up. Ow, 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 ow. Guess not. What are you doing? Go. Go to mama. Ah, the dog's harassing me. Anyway, moving on.
Go through everything that has been written, literally everything that's ever been written about the Horus Heresy in terms of our series and all the other books and background lore and codex.
Oh my God.
Lift every reference to the siege of the Palace of Terra, and somehow chart it and make a compendium so we can then convert that into a piece of data, piece of usable, shareable data that has everything on it. And that even included going forward into things like the Beast Arises series, which of course a lot of that is set on Terra as well. So there's stuff that is established there that we sort of need to bear in mind. And we all agreed that was important. Absolutely vital. Couldn't move forward without it until it was, and I think it was John French said, before we map Terra and the Palace, could we maybe map the solar system? And we realised that it was even bigger than we could possibly imagine. And we now have or we are now building an extraordinarily comprehensive body of information that we are using as our frame of reference that tries to the best of our abilities to incorporate everything. I don't know if that will ever be available to the public. I don't know whether there's ever going to be some kind of like great compendium of all the crap the guys assembled, but there's some great stuff in there, and obviously
I personally would love to see a compendium put out with all their notes and stuff like that. I would get that. I would definitely get that. That would be number one on my Christmas wish list.
Certain elements of it will be segmented. You'll see it in the text, but a lot of the books will probably have maps as well out there. But it is vast, and that in itself was a really useful process, actually, creatively speaking, because we all think about Terra, huge, Palace of Terra, absolutely gigantic, huge landscape. Therefore, we've seen the artwork, we've all in our mind. But when you actually start to map it, literally map it, and you talk about the area that we know that it covers and where things need to be in relation to, and how big some of those things are, how big is the Lion's Gate, and therefore how far away from X does it need to be, that kind of stuff. It gives you, as an author, this extraordinary sense of scale. It's even bigger than you thought it was. So it enables your imagination to hopefully portray it better, because I think there's a danger of sitting down and going, the Siege of Terra, that's going to be big, and then writing something, going, I'm just going to make it big and really big. And then actually when it comes out, realise that actually it was inadequately big. It was as big as your imagination that afternoon and didn't fully suggest the overwhelming majesty and scale of what we're dealing with. And I think that's one of the really, really important things. We were talking about, as a good example, no spoilers, but obviously a lot of the action in the series will involve the fights for the various starports that are mentioned, the key established parts of the lore. That the battle for various starports was really, really important. And I think we started out thinking, foolishly, that a starport was sort of like a big science fiction airport. It was like Heathrow, but a bit bigger, And then we started to talk about logistically what a starport needed to be and how it needed to work, and completely and so what we've ended up with staggers us. Just the scale and the necessary structure of these things. It's not the way we imagined it, and therefore that in itself alters the storytelling too, because it's kind of the battles and fights that can happen around that are not the things that we imagined it's not tanks rolling across runway 4, attacking the conning tower. It's not that. It is a completely different scale of things. And so the actual story, the actual mechanics of the battle have come out of the fact that we have mapped it, not just to keep track of it, but it's actually helped us tell the story because it showed us what the story necessarily has to be.
Oof.
The story is driven by the Primarchs, obviously, but the Primarchs have that, as I talked about just now, that have that Titanic quality to them, in as much as, again, their individual story arcs and fates in most cases are known at least vaguely, if not very specifically.
Right.
We know what's going to happen to them. So if our focus from day one had been on that, that would be ultimately unrewarding. It would be a nice big colourful way of telling you a story you already knew. So right from day one we've gone, well, we need by necessity to have clearly an awful lot of other people around them. Let's have those other people, and let's create characters who have become much more viewpoint characters and play an important role, and perhaps an unexpectedly important role in the story. So that gave us creative freedom to tell individual story arcs that could come as a surprise, where something that we weren't expecting would happen, and we would have characters that we cared about because we didn't know what was going to happen to them in the course of the story.
One of the best things about it is one of the best things about the Horus Heresy is I've gotten attached to a lot of the characters that have been written. Just when they die, it bothers me. It literally bothers me. I just remember reading the third book and just there was at one point I just sat there and I was at work and I just stopped working and I just started rubbing my brow because I was sitting there listening to one of my favorite characters get killed, and I was just unhappy with it. But it was going to happen. You knew it was going to happen. You knew it was going to happen.
But also because the whole thing is about clearly loyalty and disloyalty, and it's about the bonds that are formed through the rank structure. So it was really important, for instance, for a Primarch that we saw at the very least his senior captains and the officers serving under him and the troops below that and the people that they might be allied to see how their decisions about whether they were going to be a loyalist or a traitor had a profound effect on whether people would stand with them or against them, etc., etc., etc. So actually the whole dynamic of a civil war, the whole dynamic of the heresy, is told because we've got the stratification of characters. But it does give us this great opportunity, particularly now in the closing stages, that we have very important characters. Loken is a great example of that, who's been there from book one, whose fate is not known to the readership because there's a character who was introduced in these novels. There is an enormous pleasure in playing those individual stories out and seeing what we can do with them. Some of them inevitably will end with the Siege of Terra because it is a bloodbath.
Yes, it is.
Some may survive or go on to do other things or develop in different ways. It's difficult to tell. I think the one thing we had to curb our... We actually early on, when we were planning, we all had our favourite characters in terms of the secondary ones, non-Primarch characters. And we started planning what we wanted to do, which ones were up for grabs and which ones we could, can we kill this guy off, or has he got to go on and do something important? And we realised that we had subconsciously developed such affection for these characters, both good characters and bad characters. We did develop such an affection for them. There was a danger that we were trying to spare too many of them because we dreamed that actually they would one day show up, and they were character X was remarkably, he was a veteran of the Horus Heresy but had survived all the way through to 40k, and went, that's actually happening way too much. You can't have that. This has got to be much more decisive. It's got to have a great sense of closure, because these are, from a 40k perspective, legendary characters. Very few of them should literally survive through to 40k. And even the memory of most, and the importance of most, or even the reality of them, even if they're a name remembered from the past, they are remembered as we would remember a sort of a myth or a legendary hero, they should be our Achilles and our Hercules and this kind of stuff, and therefore they need to have decisive things happen to them. So there is that's probably the most painful part of it, is working out how to deal with them best, how much fun we can have doing unexpected connective things with them, and then the sense of loss. This is a character some of us have worked on the same character, so we all have fondness, but we all have characters that we've created that after 10 plus years, this is the final hurrah for some of these people. That's a weird thing to do, but I think
I honestly feel with them for that. I mean, I just think that there's been so much done with the heresy. There's so many characters in it right now, some of which, like the last book I read, a character that's been there since book one, finally, it was like, you read this character dying and you just sit there and you're like, wow, I have read about this person for years and now they're gone. And it's sad.
I said they've always been essential, but I think here they are really essential because I think that's where the dramatic twists and turns and surprises will really come from, because the readers, I know, are rooting for quite a lot of these characters because they like them, and to see, will they make it? What's going to happen? What is their fate going to be? And, that is where the drama of the story lies. Mm-hmm. Obviously the key players are the superhuman Primarchs and the Space Marines and everything like that, and Adeptus Mechanicus and that kind of stuff. I think the playing around with the human level of it, which actually is the vast majority of what's going on, is it's a human tragedy, because that represents, by far and away the largest number of people involved in this. Right. It's quite a difficult line to walk, because on the one hand, making their fates inevitable and making that sort of slaughter wholesale and it, is entirely appropriate for the point we're trying to get across. Everything's got to be big. So having millions and millions of guardsmen and everything like that being obliterated on the field of battle gives weight to the idea this is the greatest conflict that history has ever known, and therefore is appropriate to the scale. On the other hand, we've all got a desire to reflect the human level of it, because after all, the humanity is what it's all about. The Primarchs and the Space Marines are essentially instruments for the protection of humanity's future, and therefore the human cost has got to be important. Otherwise, what's the point of doing any of this in the first place?
Exactly.
And there is I guess we're swinging our camera metaphorically up and down from the biggest scale, the very, very most important players and what they're doing, right the way down to sort of ground level to very, very ordinary people, and again having to resist the temptation of going, we're going to introduce these 3 plucky army soldiers here, beginning of this book, who we'll see them go through hell in the course of the Horus Heresy, and then they'll just die because that's what's happening to all the humans. There's got to be more texture there. Mm-hmm. So actually, not for the first time, but on an unprecedented scale, the human element in this story has got to be reflected very, 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 very accurately, without sort of overbalancing the whole thing. So it's probably always been the trickiest thing, but up to now, because the stories have been very, a novel is very much about a Primarch or a Legion, there have been sort of those sort of deft ways of sidestepping that issue, whereas we can't here, because it's almost like it's the biggest party in the history of the universe and everyone's turned up, and therefore we need to have an accurate record of all of that. We're thinking of ingenious ways of doing it.
One of the biggest things for me is when I read about standard humans, what they're actually going through, what they're seeing, how they're feeling about things. Of course, I love the stories of the Primarchs, and I love the stories of the Space Marines, everything like that I really enjoy. I love the stories of the Perpetuals. But if there's one critique I could have made, I'd love to see some more stories of baseline humans going through the things that they're going through. In fact, there was one book, a lot of people didn't like it. I actually did. And the book was, God, come on, what was the name of that book? It covered an astropath who was receiving retraining, and they were trying to see if he could be useful to the Great Crusade, or if he was going to basically turn into, kiddie treats for the Emperor. And the whole book it detailed what happened when Magnus actually broke through the seals in the Imperial Palace, when the psychic wards finally broke under the Palace of Terra. But I consider it one of the best ones because it actually talked about the humans, what they were going through, what they were experiencing, what they were seeing, and what they were saying.
I think the tragedy of the heresy as a whole is well, it comes in several stages actually. First of all, I think and it's something we tried to do very much was to show how extraordinarily positive the Imperium had been just prior to the beginning of the heresy. That actually this was a sort of a glorious golden age master plan for the way that humanity could live as an intergalactic empire that was so close to working before the wheels came off. And that, I think that the idea that this was a dream that was almost accomplished and then collapsed is possibly the great tragedy.
Yeah.
There are, of course, individual tragedies in that. The individual tragedies of the traitor Primarchs, particularly because of the great promise that each one of them held, and the way that those things have been subverted, not necessarily always by their own pride or whatever. Their fate has taken a huge hand in this. I think as we reach the end, there are other deeper tragedies that are looming out, and the two that really strike me is, first of all, a sense that all along the heresy has been a really bad negative reaction against the Emperor's plan for humanity, and that is the great loss and the great fall, the great tragedy of the story. Except that as we've gone along, even though we might not necessarily be agreeing with the traitor side of the argument or with Horus, because clearly there are, deeply unpleasant motivating factors there, is that the actual dream itself that has now come apart is now being held up for greater scrutiny. Is the idea that the Emperor's thing was not so sort of unequivocally wonderful. What was he driving towards, and would it in its own way been not as bad but differently bad, that if he actually accomplished this rather than being derailed by the efforts of chaos, that this grand plan, this idea that the Emperor is kind of omnipotent and omniscient and wonderful, and therefore he cannot possibly have made a mistake, you begin to question in the first place what he was doing and how and why he was doing it.
Exactly.
For us to ever have got into this mess anyway. And I think that's really interesting, and that's an angle that really has begun to surface more and more, and certainly in the Siege of Terra books does. Not to undermine him, but to at least offer a counterpoint to the idea that he is this infallible being with a great dream for mankind that was so cruelly diverted. To me, the other great tragedy is the inherent part of what the Horus Heresy is, which is, of course, created X number of years ago as an explicatory myth to explain the 40k universe. 40k being, sort of the something that we all immersed in, and an environment that we think is fantastic, and that readers and players come to because it has a very, very distinct quality all of its own. So the Horus Heresy always existed as the sort of foundation myth to explain why things were like this. And I think that's, we now reach the end of the Horus Heresy, there is this, to me, the most tragic thing of all is the idea that that any victory that can be plucked from the claws, fists, jaws, whatever, of chaos at this point is going to be so hollow, because we know that the only victorious consequence from the point of view of the loyalists is to create a universe like 40k, which might be amazing and might look fantastic and might be immersive and might be very atmospheric, but is clearly awful to live in. Yeah. So this stagnated, rotting, decomposing corpse of a society that has that can barely sustain itself and is slowly, very, very slowly, sort of going towards this lingering death, which is the essence of what 40k is, which is absolutely fantastic as a setting. But the idea that's what victory looks like. That it's almost like the Imperium has been so mortally wounded that even though the forces of good might triumph, it is really a matter of
forces of good. Forces of good. Yeah, no. We'll take a drink to that. Forces of good.
Of sort of sustaining something that is broken irrevocably, and I think to me that's really interesting. I think any 40k fan reading the Horus Heresy, knowing 40k, I think is got that sort of that sort of sense of melancholy and loss is pre-built in because because there is an immense amount of foreshadowing. It is, we know where this is going.
Yes, we do.
In the long term, we know what the awful grinding consequences for century after century after century is going to be because of that, and I think that's a really important thing to play with. If the Horus Heresy had been written and there was no 40k and this was just a series we'd written, people would get quite excited. I suppose it would be more like something like, I suppose, Star Wars, where you're going, oh, they're battling the evil empire, but when they win at the end, it's going to be happy ever after. But we know it isn't happy ever after, and I think that is the most important atmospheric, tonal quality of the whole thing.
Yeah. That's going to be the best thing. That's the best thing about it for me, because even though I know how this ends, I know what's going to happen. It's going to turn to pure hell. But it's the journey, Vic.
Oh gosh, there are probably a whole bunch of odd memories associated with spending so much time, at least intermittently, connecting to this. And I think creatively, to go back on something I said earlier on, I think creatively I have enormously fond memories of the kind of team spirit and camaraderie of the writers and the editorial staff working together to try and make it as good as we can possibly get it. And that also includes people like Neil doing the covers and everything like that. There's this sense of a creative team, which is extremely rare in sort of fiction publishing. And I think that's tremendous. There's this now a great sense of achievement when we look back and go, look at that. It's one of the longest sustained series of science fiction ever, you know, sort of. Yeah. There are sort of accomplishment factors that I have fond memories of. There are also very vivid memories of the early days and the excitement of setting things up, but also strange lacks of memory. I look back on things like Horus Rising, I suppose, and Prospero Burns and Legion, where I was inventing, and must be true of the other authors with their own books, but from my point of view, writing those things, where there was so much that it was invented, that it defined the heresy era, terminology and characters and structures and society ideas and all sorts of things like that, which I kind of don't remember inventing. I don't mean it was all a blur. What I mean was it just all seemed organic. I didn't sit down and sort of rigorously build a world that we could then all work in, and I'm sure Graham didn't do the same on the second book. And it was almost spontaneous. You know, things happened, and we went, that's right, that feels right. We'll go with that. So looking back on it, I look back on Horus Rising, thinking I should remember that as being an incredibly demanding, difficult book to write, because upon it rested so much. But it wasn't. It was enormous fun to write, and it didn't seem especially hard. I mean, it had the usual demands of a novel. It didn't seem especially hard, and it didn't even seem to have the kind of I don't even remember having the pressure attached to it that it should have had in terms of what it was. It was just, so those sort of flamboyant gestures of creativity that you'll see in the way each one of us have taken different legions and different characters and different things and done things with them, they all seem to be organic. And looking back on it, that seems to be weird. Probably my abiding memory, this is weird, my abiding memory is the fact that I remember being asked, sitting in my office, writing the introduction to the 5th anniversary edition of Horus Rising, because the book had been out, it had been a huge success, and it had been out for 5 years, and they were doing a new edition because it was 5 years old. And that seeming like an enormously big deal. 5 years, I couldn't believe, 5 years, so much has changed, oh my goodness me, that's blah blah, all those kind of things, which now seems ridiculous. Me sitting down and writing that introduction to the 5th anniversary edition seems longer ago than starting the series in the first place. It's something, like any of these long-running series that you get attached to, either because it's your own series or something you're part of, it just becomes part and parcel of, and sometimes it feels like only yesterday that we started, and I could actually go back and, I guess, map out a timeline of when the books were published and when we started, and actually compare it to my life and think, goodness me, you know, how things have changed in the course of doing that, how things have altered, how just going to like Black Library weekenders or games days or signings and stuff like that, and meeting fans. It was always good, lovely to meet readers and talk.
I can relate to this. I sometimes go all the way back to the very first video I ever uploaded, and my God, it was horrible. I had I had the screen set up over here, but it was really tiny. I was massive. I didn't have anything. The camera was a joke. The microphone was this microphone right here. So I was basically talking into here and trying not to move my head too much to make the thing rattle. Oh man. There was just so much wrong. Like, I didn't even know what to say. Like, my first words were, "Hey, YouTube." And that's all I knew what to say. I've gotten more comfortable with it over the years, but at the same time, every once in a while I go back and I look at that first video I ever recorded. And like, wow, that's how far I've actually come. Like, I've got a whole bunch of plans for this area here. Right now, I've got the backlighting right here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get some LED lights and put them back here and over here, stuff like that. Other things like that. Just shutting up, moving on.
Talk to them like that, and realising that actually there are new generations of readers, that we've now got avid readers of the Horus Heresy who weren't old enough to read it when it started, which freaks me completely out. The idea that there is, there are still people who have been reading ever since day one, but the idea that there is this, that there are generations and generations coming along and catching up and reading up and following this thing, and sort of the idea that it's enduring. It's not like it's sort of not like a bi-weekly soap opera on the television where you just start watching it and enjoy it and then you stop watching it and you don't ever go back and worry about it. That these things are, people want to read the whole thing and they want to get connected to it and they want to follow it through to its conclusion, even if they only joined in once it was well underway. So those sorts of things are really very, very weird indeed. Yeah, I ought to be able to tell you stories about remembering key moments of, the day I invented Loken because... And I don't, because it didn't work like that. It really wasn't like, I was writing a book and there was Loken and he was in the story and it was all going along fine. And then afterwards I went, oh, he's quite an important character. And he has become an important character. It's not, it doesn't have, maybe it's because we're subjecting this to particular scrutiny, and maybe that happens in all the stuff I write. But I think it's because there is a wonderfully democratic process around the table with the writers, so that we've always thrown ideas in, not because the best ideas we can come up with, we've thrown into the pot, not necessarily presuming in advance that we are the ones who are going to write those things, and actually not being so sort of territorial that we demand that we are the ones who write those things. So all these great ideas, some of which it's difficult to track, who first came up with this, that and the other, they're there. So these characters even like Loken have, to me, a separate identity to me in a way that, say, a character like Gaunt doesn't, because Gaunt's very much, sort of mine, and, the idea that we have taken those characters and we've all written them and they've moved from book to book and this kind of stuff. It's like they have a complete identity of their own, which, again, looking back on it, is an unusual and really pleasant thing to remember, and I think that will last for a long time. We are all finding ourselves remembering stuff we wrote earlier on, which now seems to have a greater significance now we're reaching the end. What was once a throwaway line seems now to be incredibly portentous. So I think we want to mine that sense of doing great callbacks to things that happened before. And I think the trick there is not to do it too obviously, not to do all the obvious things that people are expecting. I think a lot of people have come to me.
I remember the first line of Horus Rising was, "I was there the day that Horus killed the Emperor, or slew the Emperor." And as a person who was really into 40K at that point, I read that and I was like, well, you got me. Let's go.
He said, yeah, of course, the last book will start with the same line or a version of the same line. I'm going, will it, though? Because won't that be what everyone's expecting? And that'll be sort of too obvious. I can't tell you what it is, but at the last meeting, actually, somebody cited something from one of the early books and said, this is a great, and we went, oh, yeah, God, we forgot we said that. That with its context changed to now the Siege of Terra, is such a fantastic thing to do. But I certainly think there is, that we're sort of looking back and scrutinising the things that we almost wrote in a throwaway thing, knowing at the back of our minds where the story was going. But now we've got there, we're going, that matters hugely. That, you know, what character A says to character B there matters hugely, because now that moment has arrived. But even coming down to it, the first line of Horus Rising, I was the day that Horus slew the Emperor, was clearly a deliberately provocative line on my part. I mean, it was, there's no doubt about it. It was misdirection. It was deliberately meant to sort of tease and provoke. And I think a lot of stuff about Horus Rising as a novel was about foreshadowing. The fact that the sort of the nudge, nudge, wink, giggle, giggle of knowing where this is going. So all of those things played an important part in the story. But I know that I tend to have, you know, going to a signing, people come and get their books signed. And I always like to write something, rather than just sign things, I like to write a quote or a comment in it. And because I've written quite a lot of novels, I tend to have a couple of phrases for each series that I don't have to rack my brains thinking, oh gosh, what shall I write in this? It's like, you know, sort of, if it's a Gaunt's Ghost book, it's probably going to get something like The Emperor Protects written in it, because that's the way it works. Or if it's an Inquisitor novel, it's going to be, you know, Repent Heretic, or whatever it is. But so right from the day one when Horus Rising was published, in the spirit of the same provocative nature, I tended to sign my name and write the line, "The Emperor must die," because it seemed to be sort of showing, perhaps artificially, my colours and loyalty and whatever. And I've just done that, almost on automatic ever since. You know, sort of that's a line that gets trotted out all over the place. And I think when I got to Unremembered Empire, because that was about Gilliman and sort of trying to save what was left of the Imperium, I started to change it to the
traitor.
The Emperor must live, just because, you know, sort of, but I recently, obviously, we've been thinking about titles for the last few books and what we're going to use, and some of the quotes we're going to. And I sat there and I suddenly went, do you know what? Maybe the last book should be called The Emperor Must Die, because this ridiculously glib, out-of-universe phrase that I've been using for 10 years suddenly had a resonance that I did not expect it to have. And I thought, actually, now it can be in universe. I can imagine that being, you know, rather than it might have been whispered sometime during the early books by somebody who was particularly bad, but now I can imagine millions of Space Marines chanting it, and that is the point at which I went. That's weird. That's weird that kind of that throwawayness has dovetailed into something in a way that may prove to be portentous and useful.
When I used to write a lot, and there was a character that I wrote quite extensively on, and I wish I still had some of the old stories that I had from him. But one of the things that he would do, he was a very silent person. He didn't speak. In fact, it was in the books one time. He said 2 complete sentences, and the bar owner was getting ready to run away because he was convinced that, you know, this guy was going to just start randomly killing people. But he would make a gesture with his hand, and it was only in relation to one other person, and it showed the only sign of humanity that character actually displayed. But yeah, I don't know why I share that little tidbit, but shutting up. Moving on. Expectations.
What?
Okay, expectations of the Siege of Terra. Emperor's gonna wind up in the Golden Throne. Sanguinius is gonna die. Horus is gonna get deleted from existence.
What sort of things can we safely expect from the heresy? I'm tempted to give you a silly answer like, well, you know, lots of shooty death kill in space. Well, shooty death kill on Terra. And inevitably epic scale, and, you know, all the obvious things. But the most obvious thing is that we're going to tell the story. People know, or if you want to go and look for the story, you can look it up online. You can go and read the you know, the sort of the background books. That's the story you're going to get. But it's that story filled out and sort of suitably not expanded but explored, so that there is a great deal more detail to it in that. So it's going to be a very, very epic thing. I mean, just because you know how Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet end doesn't mean to say you don't want to go and watch a production of it, because there is you know, a great deal to be gained from actually watching it happen. I think there's, I don't know, what else are you going to get? I mean, I think there are some. I think there are some genuine surprises, and they're not forced surprises at all. They're not clever tricks that we thought we can stick that in there and they won't see that coming, and we can just about get away with pretending that actually happened, as it were. There are we've thought of some really clever connections between things and things that will fit into places that move things one to another that I think will properly delight people and in many cases give a great deal more. There's a lot of the stuff in 40k is based on the myths of the Horus Heresy,
right.
And those myths have come down through history, been repeated by the victors, etc., simplified, become symbolic. So we're going to see the non-symbolic actual version of some of these things,
nice.
And actually how they play out in reality does not deny or contradict the myth, but actually shows you that actually there was something slightly different going on. So I think there is a lot to be gained in the story where people will be genuinely delighted to see what really happened. And also wait. I think there's sort of newness and surprise to come from some of the insight we get about the way the Imperium and the Emperor works or worked at that point. That there is some continuity-based stuff that will be vital and fascinating to fans of the universe. And also, I think more than anything else, it's an opportunity, perhaps the last opportunity, to see many of these great characters, Primarchs and key Space Marine characters, and key characters full stop.
I'm going to hate the fact that I'm never going to see Rogel Dorn again. I'm going to hate the fact that I probably seen the last of Perturabo, because Perturabo was a beast, man. Being themselves in the most archetypical way, that is, sort of, so to watch Dawn, who is the great defender, defending, his greatest act of defence. This is him at work. To see characters who are particularly famous for a particular attribute or skill, to see them doing that thing, the absolute quintessence of what they are, I think is going to be tremendously exciting, because it never happens again on this scale. Some major characters do survive. We might see a Primarch do something extraordinary again later on, but never so many in one place at one time doing something absolutely exceptional and extraordinary. And often, I think I might compare it to the idea in another book. You might be reading a novel in which there was a Primarch involved, and there were 3 or 4 storylines, and we were cutting between them, and the sort of the biggest and loudest and most exciting thing was the storyline with the Primarch in it. But then we cut back to this thing, the B story and the C story. And there's going to come a point in the Horus Heresy, Siege of Terra novels, where we're doing that, multi-stranded stories running through novels because we're cutting from one to another because there are important events happening simultaneously, and each one will be absolutely staggering and earth-shaking because of who's involved in it. There's no filler here. There's no room for filler because there are so many big things that happen, and I think that's going to it's got to make them very, very exciting. This is a climactic moment of a vastly epic story, and in some respects, even though it's spread out over a number of volumes and it's written by a group of writers, it is almost like it's one gigantic novel telling you this event, this great historical event. So I think there's some good reasons to go out and read it. Well, that is the Siege of Terra with Dan Abnett talking about it. Now, I gotta tell you, Siege of Terra, after reading all the build-up for all the years that I've read it, getting these books has been something else. And reading about some of these characters, and just the amount of time, the amount of books, the amount of storylines, and there's been very few disappointments for me reading these. One of my favorite Primarch books is the Primarch for Conrad Curse, because it's legitimately creepy. But in any case, well, that's this. I'm actually going to go now, and I'm putting some stuff up to render, for videos, and I'm going to have it uploading. I'm going to be taking care of stuff around the house. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to be listening to the last 30, 45 minutes of Mortis that I have, and then I'm going to be starting on the very next Siege of Terra book. I don't know. I can't wait. I honestly can't. All that being said, like and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps me out with the algorithm if you hit the like button at all. And if you guys would like, I have a Patreon down below. I will see you guys next time. You guys have a great day.